On a winter morning in December 2006, in the small mountain town of Salmon, Idaho, a young mother placed a phone call that would echo through 2 decades of silence. Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed terrible words. She told authorities her husband was missing. She said he had left their home the previous evening and never returned. She said she was worried. But in the spaces between her words, in the particular cadence of her concern, something felt wrong to those who listened. This is the story of Angie Craig, Michael Craig, and the 18 years it took for truth to surface from beneath the snow. The question that haunted investigators from that very first morning was simple, yet profound. How does a man vanish completely in a town where everyone knows your name? The story begins not with blood or violence, but with a phone call made in daylight hours, with children's voices audible in the background, with a tone that suggested inconvenience rather than terror. It begins with a woman reporting her husband missing, and with the peculiar detail that she had waited nearly 12 hours to make that call. By the time deputies arrived at the Craig residence on a residential street lined with modest homes and pickup trucks dusted with snow, Michael Craig had been gone for what his wife estimated was 14 hours. The sun was already climbing toward noon. The children were fed and dressed. The house was quiet, and Angie Craig stood in her doorway with red eyes that held something deputies would later describe in their notes as strangely distant, as though she were watching herself from somewhere else entirely. Salmon, Idaho sits in a valley carved by the Salmon River, surrounded by mountains that turn white each November and stay that way until April. Population barely 3,000. The kind of place where the high school gymnasium doubles as a community center, where the grocery store posts handwritten signs about lost dogs and church potlucks, where everyone recognizes everyone else's vehicle before they can make out the driver's face. In 2006, it was a town sustained by logging, ranching, and the quiet determination of people who chose harsh winters and long distances over the complications of city life. The nearest major hospital was 2 hours away. The nearest shopping mall 4. People here knew their neighbors. They borrowed tools and returned them. They waved from passing trucks. They noticed when someone's routine changed, when a familiar vehicle wasn't parked in its usual spot, when someone went missing. Michael Craig was 36 years old that December. He worked irregular hours doing construction and odd jobs, the kind of work that ebbs in winter when the ground freezes solid and outdoor projects shut down. He was known around town as quiet, reliable when sober, troubled when drinking. Those who knew him said he had a gentleness about him, particularly with his children. He had 2 daughters from a previous relationship and a son with Angie, who was 7 months old that winter. People remembered seeing Michael at the gas station, at the feed store, at the bar on Friday nights nursing a beer and watching whatever game played on the television mounted above the counter. He drove an older model truck, dark blue, with a dent in the passenger door and a toolbox in the bed. On the morning of December 14, 2006, that truck sat in the driveway of the Craig home, covered in a thin layer of frost. Michael was nowhere to be found. The day before had been unremarkable in every measurable way. A Thursday, temperature in the low 20s, sky the color of concrete. Michael had been home most of the day. Neighbors saw his truck parked in its usual spot. One neighbor recalled seeing him carry firewood from a pile beside the garage around 3 in the afternoon. Another remembered hearing country music playing from the open garage around 5, though they couldn't be certain it was that specific day or simply a memory collapsed with many similar days. By evening, the house was dark except for the blue flicker of a television visible through the front window. By midnight, the street was silent. By morning, Michael Craig had ceased to exist in any verifiable way. Angie Craig's account of that evening would remain remarkably consistent across multiple tellings, consistent in a way that investigators would later note felt rehearsed rather than remembered. She said Michael had been drinking. She said they had argued. She said the argument was not unusual, nothing more heated than the low-grade tensions that characterized their marriage in those months. She said he left around 10 at night, walking, without his coat, saying he needed air and time to think. She said she assumed he went to a friend's house, or to the bar, or simply walked the dark streets until his anger cooled. She said she put their infant son to bed and fell asleep on the couch. She said she woke around 8 in the morning, found Michael still gone, waited a few more hours thinking he would return, then called the sheriff's office at 11:43. Those who have ever lived in a small town in winter understand that nobody walks anywhere at night when the temperature drops below freezing. Nobody leaves without a coat when snow dusts the ground. Nobody disappears for 12 hours without someone seeing something, without leaving tracks, without some trace of passage through a landscape where every footprint shows. The deputies who responded to Angie's call understood this immediately. They also understood that in domestic situations, the story told first is often the story that conceals most. The initial search began within an hour of the report. Deputies walked the streets radiating out from the Craig home in expanding circles. They checked the bar where Michael sometimes drank. They knocked on doors of known associates. They walked the riverbank, though the water ran so cold that anyone falling in would have minutes at best. They found nothing. No tracks in the snow that couldn't be attributed to routine foot traffic. No witnesses who remembered seeing a man walking alone the night before. No bartender who recalled serving Michael Craig. The owner of the Last Chance Saloon checked his receipts and security footage. Michael hadn't been there. The friends Angie suggested they contact said they hadn't seen him in days, some in weeks. By afternoon, as light began to fail and temperature dropped, the search expanded to include volunteer crews organized through the fire department. 47 people showed up that first evening to search for Michael Craig. They came with flashlights and thermoses of coffee, with dogs and all-terrain vehicles, with the grim knowledge that a man without shelter in these temperatures might not survive until morning. They searched through the night, calling his name into darkness that swallowed sound, combing through outbuildings and abandoned structures, checking vehicles parked along the highway. They found a homeless man sleeping in a defunct grain silo. They found 3 deer carcasses hung to age in an unlocked shed. They found beer cans and cigarette butts and a child's bicycle lying in a ditch. They did not find Michael Craig. Angie remained at home during the search, as instructed by deputies who told her she needed to stay available in case Michael returned or tried to make contact. Neighbors who stopped by to offer support later told investigators that she seemed calm, perhaps too calm. She made sandwiches for the search volunteers. She answered questions with precise, economical sentences. She held her infant son and stared out the window at the headlights sweeping across distant fields. One neighbor, a woman named Patricia Hendricks who had known the Craigs for 3 years, recalled thinking that Angie looked like someone waiting for news she already knew was coming. Another neighbor, Dale Morrison, remembered standing in the Craig living room that evening and noticing how clean everything was, how the house smelled of bleach and pine cleaner, how no dishes sat in the sink, no clutter on the counters, nothing out of place. It looked, he would later testify, like someone had scrubbed it top to bottom that very day. By dawn on December 15, more than 60 hours after Michael Craig allegedly walked out his front door, the search had covered every building, every vehicle, every conceivable location within a 10-mile radius of Salmon. Divers checked the sections of river where ice hadn't yet formed a complete sheet. Aircraft flew grid patterns over surrounding wilderness. Nothing. It was as though Michael Craig had simply evaporated into the frozen air. Part 2. The Investigation. The transition from missing person case to something more sinister happened gradually, then all at once. For the first 72 hours, deputies operated under the assumption that Michael Craig might still be alive, might be found disoriented in some remote location, might turn up at a hospital or shelter. They checked his bank account, which showed no activity since December 13. They pinged his cell phone, which went directly to voicemail and appeared to be turned off. They contacted relatives in neighboring states. His mother in Montana hadn't heard from him in 2 weeks. His brother in Oregon said they'd spoken briefly by phone on December 10, a conversation he described as unremarkable, mostly about weather and holiday plans. Nobody reported any indication that Michael was planning to leave, to run, to disappear. On December 16, investigators obtained permission to conduct a thorough search of the Craig home. Angie Craig signed the consent form without hesitation, without requesting an attorney, without expressing any concern about what they might find. The search team, led by Detective Sarah Williamson of the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office, arrived at 8 in the morning with evidence collection kits, cameras, and a trained cadaver dog named Rex. They would spend 14 hours processing that modest 3-bedroom house. They would find both everything and nothing. The house was immaculate, not lived in clean but scrubbed clean, the kind of clean that draws attention to itself. The floors gleamed. The bathroom tiles showed no soap scum. The kitchen counters had been wiped down with something that left them slightly sticky to the touch, suggesting repeated applications of cleaning solution. In the garage, they found containers of bleach, ammonia-based cleaner, and industrial-strength degreaser, all recently purchased according to receipts found in the kitchen trash. In the master bedroom, they found a mattress that appeared new or newly cleaned, with no stains visible to the naked eye. They photographed everything. They swabbed surfaces. They collected samples from drains. They brought in luminol to check for blood traces that might have been cleaned. In the bathroom, the luminol revealed a faint positive reaction near the base of the toilet and along the baseboard behind the door. Not conclusive, not definitive, but present. Rex, the cadaver dog, showed interest in 3 locations within the home: the master bedroom closet, the garage floor near the deep freezer, and a section of carpet in the hallway between the bedrooms and bathroom. These were marked and documented. Sections of carpet were removed for laboratory analysis. The freezer was emptied and inspected. It contained frozen vegetables, ground meat, and several unlabeled packages wrapped in butcher paper. These were seized as evidence. The packages would later be identified as venison, legally harvested elk meat, and beef from a local ranch. No human tissue, no hidden remains. Deputies interviewed Angie Craig 3 times in those first days. Each interview was recorded. Each covered the same ground: the timeline of December 13, the nature of their argument, Michael's state of mind, his habits and routines. Her answers remained consistent, remarkably consistent. She said they fought about money. She said Michael had been drinking more than usual as work dried up for winter. She said he sometimes walked when upset, though never at night, never without telling her where he was going. She said she didn't call earlier because he'd done this before, stayed out all night, come back in the morning acting like nothing happened. When asked if she had any theory about what might have happened, she said no. When asked if Michael had enemies, she said no. When asked if their marriage was troubled, she said, no more than any marriage. But people talk in small towns. Within days, investigators heard from multiple sources about tensions in the Craig household. A coworker of Michael's said Michael had confided that he was thinking about leaving, about starting over somewhere else, about concerns for his safety, though he never specified from what. A bartender remembered Michael saying his wife had a temper, that she threw things when angry, that he sometimes slept in his truck after arguments. A neighbor recalled hearing shouting from the Craig home on several occasions, including loud crashes that sounded like furniture being overturned. Another neighbor reported that Angie had asked to borrow a tarp and rope in early December, returning them several days later, cleaned so thoroughly that they looked new. Detective Williamson noted in her case file, subject's affect remains flat, no observable grief response, answers questions without elaboration, makes eye contact but gaze feels vacant. When asked about husband's whereabouts, she shrugs. When shown photo of husband, no emotional response visible. When infant son began crying during interview, subject did not immediately respond to soothe child. Neighbor had to prompt her. This officer has interviewed many spouses of missing persons. This is not how innocent people behave. The physical evidence, however, remained frustratingly inconclusive. The blood traces in the bathroom were tested. The DNA came back as belonging to Michael Craig, but the amount was minimal, consistent with a shaving accident or minor household injury. The carpet samples showed cleaning product residue but no biological material. The freezer revealed nothing unusual. Michael's truck was processed for evidence. In the bed of the truck, technicians found soil samples, wood shavings, and trace amounts of blood that matched deer DNA, consistent with Michael's hunting activities. Nothing pointed definitively to violence. Nothing proved a body had been moved. Nothing connected Angie Craig to any crime beyond reasonable doubt. As December turned to January, the investigation began to slow. Leads dried up. The trail, already cold, grew colder. Deputies continued to follow up on reported sightings of Michael Craig in neighboring towns, all of which proved to be mistaken identity. They checked hospitals, morgues, homeless shelters across 3 states. Nothing. The working theory, unspoken but understood, was that Michael Craig was deceased, that his body was somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding Salmon, that it would likely never be found. The official case status remained open as a missing person investigation. Unofficially, detectives whispered to each other in the break room. She knows something, she did something, but we can't prove it. In February 2007, Angie Craig appeared on local news pleading for information about her missing husband. She wore a dark sweater and minimal makeup. Her infant son sat on her lap. She read from a prepared statement, her voice steady, almost monotone. If anyone has seen Michael, if anyone knows anything about where he might be, please come forward. Our son needs his father. I need my husband. Please help us bring him home. The camera held on her face for several long seconds after she finished speaking. Her expression remained neutral. She did not cry. She barely blinked. Viewers who called into the station afterward overwhelmingly reported the same reaction. Something about her seemed wrong, seemed off, seemed like someone performing grief rather than experiencing it. By spring, the active search efforts had ceased. The case remained assigned to Detective Williamson, who continued to review evidence and conduct periodic follow-up interviews. But without new leads or witnesses, there was little forward momentum. In May, at a case review meeting, the sheriff made the decision that no one wanted to articulate but everyone understood. Without a body, without a weapon, without a witness, without a confession, there was no case to prosecute. Michael Craig had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Angie Craig continued living in the house they had shared. She continued caring for their son. She continued her life, quiet and unremarkable, while questions hung in the air like smoke that never quite dissipates. Part 3. The Silence. Time moves differently in the aftermath of unresolved tragedy. Days accumulate into months, months into years, and the urgent crisis becomes a permanent condition, a chronic wound that never quite heals. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the particular torture of suspecting terrible things while lacking confirmation, The years between 2007 and 2024 would be an eternity of waiting and wondering. Angie Craig did not leave Salmon immediately. She stayed through the summer of 2007, through the autumn when leaves turned and fell and the first snow dusted the mountains. She worked part-time at the grocery store. She took her son to the park. She attended church on Sundays, sitting in the back pew, leaving before the final hymn finished. People whispered when she passed. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others turned away. The divisions in the community were stark. Those who believed she was a grieving wife enduring unimaginable uncertainty, and those who believed she knew exactly where her husband's body lay rotting. In November 2007, Angie sold the house. She moved first to Pocatello, then to Boise, then out of state entirely, settling eventually in Oregon where no one knew her story, where her last name didn't carry the weight of suspicion. She remarried in 2011 to a man named David Fletcher. She had another child, a daughter, in 2013. From the outside, her life appeared to have moved forward, to have left behind the dark winter of 2006. But those who knew her during those years, neighbors and coworkers and acquaintances, would later recall small moments that suggested the past never truly released its grip. A neighbor in Oregon remembered Angie waking screaming from nightmares, the sounds audible through apartment walls. A coworker recalled that Angie never wanted to discuss her past, became agitated and evasive if anyone asked about her earlier marriages or her children's father. Her son from her first marriage, who by 2015 was approaching his 9th birthday, began exhibiting behavioral problems at school. Teachers reported that he drew disturbing pictures, images of figures lying motionless, of shadowy forms standing over them. When asked about the drawings, he became silent and withdrawn. Child Protective Services conducted a welfare check but found no evidence of current abuse or neglect. The boy seemed healthy, well-fed, adequately cared for. But there was something in his eyes, social workers noted, something haunted and older than his years. Angie's second marriage began to fracture around 2016. David Fletcher would later tell investigators that his wife became increasingly paranoid, convinced people were watching her, that law enforcement was monitoring her movements. She checked locks obsessively. She refused to discuss anything about her time in Idaho. When he pressed her about her first husband, she shut down completely, sometimes for days, withdrawing into silence so profound it felt like living with a ghost. In arguments, she would say things that chilled him, fragments that made no sense in isolation but accumulated into a disturbing picture. Once, during a fight about finances, she shouted, "You don't know what I've had to do to survive. You don't know what I'm capable of." Another time, after drinking too much wine, she murmured, "Sometimes people deserve what happens to them. Sometimes there's no other choice." When he asked what she meant, she claimed not to remember saying it. The boy grew older. He grew quieter. In middle school, he confided to a guidance counselor that he had bad memories from when he was small, memories that felt like dreams but might be real. He described being in a cold place, seeing something covered with a tarp, hearing his mother crying and saying, "I'm sorry," over and over. The counselor documented this and contacted Child Protective Services again. By this time, 2018, the case was 12 years old. The counselor reached out to authorities in Idaho, thinking perhaps this information might be relevant. The message made its way eventually to Detective Williamson, now a sergeant, who filed it in the ever-growing case file. Without specificity, without details, it was impossible to determine if the boy's memories were real or imagined, trauma-based or fantasy. For those who have ever tried to bury a secret so deep that you convinced yourself it never happened, the human mind performs extraordinary gymnastics. Memory becomes malleable. Reality bends around the truth you cannot acknowledge. Perhaps Angie Craig believed her own story by then. Perhaps she had told the lie so many times that it became, in some fundamental way, true. Perhaps she dreamed at night about December 2006 and woke uncertain what actually occurred and what she had constructed to replace it. The marriage to David Fletcher ended in 2020. The divorce was acrimonious. During custody proceedings regarding their daughter, David's attorney raised concerns about Angie's past, about the unsolved disappearance of her first husband, about the unresolved questions that followed her across state lines. Angie's attorney objected strenuously. No charges had ever been filed. No evidence of wrongdoing existed. The past was irrelevant to her fitness as a parent in the present. The judge, after reviewing sealed documents and interviewing both parties, awarded joint custody but required that Angie undergo psychological evaluation. The evaluation revealed someone with significant trauma history, with symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress, with difficulty forming secure attachments. Nothing in the evaluation suggested danger to her children. Nothing proved guilt. Everything hinted at shadows that wouldn't dissipate. During this same period, the boy, now 17 and preparing to graduate high school, began asking questions about his father. He searched online. He found old news articles about the disappearance. He found forums where amateur detectives discussed the case, where theories proliferated, where his mother was named as the prime suspect in speculation and accusation. He confronted her one evening in 2021, showing her printouts of articles, demanding to know what really happened. According to what he would later tell authorities, she broke down completely. She wept. She said she didn't know where his father was. She said terrible things had happened, but not the way people thought. She said someday he would understand. She said she had done everything to protect him, to give him a life, to keep him safe. When he pressed for specifics, she became hysterical, screaming that he should leave it alone, that digging up the past would destroy them both. The boy went to stay with relatives. He withdrew from his mother. He finished high school and enrolled in community college, but the questions gnawed at him. The not knowing festered. In the summer of 2023, he made a decision that would finally crack open the silence that had held for 17 years. He contacted the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office in Idaho. He said he was the son of Michael Craig, who disappeared in 2006. He said he had information. He said he was ready to tell the truth about what he remembered from when he was 7 months old, from before memory should exist, from fragments that haunted him nevertheless. Part 4. The Revelation. The phone call came into the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office on June 12, 2023. The young man on the line identified himself and explained that he was calling about a case from 2006, about Michael Craig, about his father. The desk officer transferred him to the detective division. By chance, the call reached Detective Sergeant Sarah Williamson, who had carried the Michael Craig case in her mind for 17 years, who had never quite accepted that it would remain forever unsolved. The interview that followed was conducted over video conference and lasted 4 hours. The young man, now 18 and legally an adult, spoke haltingly at first, then with increasing conviction. He described fragments of memory that no infant should possess, being held by his mother, feeling her shaking, seeing something large wrapped in dark material in the garage, hearing sounds of digging in frozen earth. He described with disturbing specificity a nighttime drive in his father's truck, sitting in his car seat while his mother drove to a location he later came to understand might be near the old copper mine north of Salmon, watching her struggle with something heavy. These memories, he explained, came back in therapy, in dreams, in flashes triggered by sounds and smells. He knew they seemed impossible. He knew people would doubt him. But he also knew, with absolute certainty, that his father hadn't walked away into the December night. More significantly, he reported a conversation he had overheard in 2020 during his mother's divorce proceedings. He had been 16, sitting in the hallway outside the attorney's office while his mother and her lawyer spoke in urgent, hushed tones. He heard his mother say, "They never found anything because I made sure there was nothing to find. I cleaned everything. I moved him where nobody would ever look, even if they suspect they can't prove it." The attorney had responded with something about not discussing this, about attorney-client privilege, about keeping certain knowledge compartmentalized. The boy had recorded this exchange on his phone. He still had the recording. Detective Williamson listened to the audio file. The quality was poor, the voices partially muffled, but the words were audible enough to be analyzed. She immediately contacted the district attorney's office. Within days, a grand jury was convened to review the evidence. The original case file from 2006, the inconsistencies in Angie Craig's statements, the physical evidence of recent cleaning, the cadaver dog reactions, the behavioral indicators, and now this new testimony and recording. The grand jury deliberated for 2 days. On June 28, 2023, they returned an indictment charging Angie Craig Fletcher with second-degree murder in the death of Michael Craig. The arrest occurred on July 5, 2023 in Eugene, Oregon. Local police, assisted by the FBI due to interstate considerations, approached Angie at her workplace, a medical office where she worked in billing. She was handcuffed without incident. Witnesses reported that she appeared shocked but not confused, as though she had been expecting this moment for 17 years. She asked only one question: "Did my son tell you?" When officers didn't respond, she smiled, a strange, sad expression, and said quietly, "I knew he would eventually. He always remembered too much." The extradition to Idaho proceeded without contest. By mid-July, Angie Craig Fletcher sat in a cell in Salmon, barely 2 miles from the house where Michael Craig had last been seen alive. The media descended on the small town. National news outlets picked up the story. Cold case solved after 17 years. Son's testimony leads to mother's arrest. The community divided again, just as sharply as in 2006, between those who felt vindicated in their suspicions and those who insisted the evidence remained circumstantial, that memory from infancy was scientifically questionable, that a recording of unclear attribution wasn't sufficient proof of anything. The preliminary hearing occurred in September 2023. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented the timeline inconsistencies from 2006. They introduced Detective Williamson's contemporaneous notes about Angie's unusual affect and behavior. They detailed the physical evidence of extensive cleaning. They played the recording made by the son, with forensic audio analysts testifying that the voice matched samples of Angie Craig Fletcher with 92% certainty. They called Michael Craig's relatives, who testified about his plans to leave the marriage, about his concerns for his safety, about conversations where he said, "If anything happens to me, you'll know who did it." The defense argued that the case was built on speculation and the unreliable testimony of a troubled young man seeking attention or closure. They noted that no body had been found, no weapon had been recovered, no witnesses placed Angie at any crime scene. The recorded conversation could be interpreted multiple ways, could refer to cleaning up after Michael left, could mean anything or nothing. The defense called psychologists who testified that infant memory of traumatic events was controversial in the scientific literature, that false memories could be implanted through suggestion and therapy, that the son's testimony was inherently unreliable. But there was one piece of evidence the defense could not explain away. During the investigation reopening in 2023, authorities obtained cadaver dogs from a specialized unit at the FBI. These dogs, trained on human decomposition scent, were brought to locations around Salmon that might be relevant. Based on the son's description of the drive to an old mining area, handlers focused on the abandoned Blackbird mine complex north of town. On August 15, 2023, a dog named Sadie alerted at a location near a collapsed mine shaft, in an area where soil showed evidence of having been disturbed, then carefully restored. Excavation began. 8 feet down, in earth that had been frozen solid for months each year, maintaining a natural refrigeration effect, they found human remains. The skeletal remains were transported to the State Forensic Laboratory. Dental records confirmed identity: Michael Craig. Cause of death was determined through careful examination of the bones. The hyoid bone in the neck showed fracture patterns consistent with manual strangulation. A small fragment of cloth found with the remains was tested and matched a tarp that had been inventoried in the Craig garage in 2006, a tarp that Angie had borrowed from a neighbor and returned meticulously cleaned. On October 10, 2023, at the continued preliminary hearing, the medical examiner testified to these findings. The courtroom was silent as photographs were presented, as technical details were explained, as the manner of death was stated clearly: homicide by asphyxiation. Angie Craig Fletcher sat at the defense table, her face pale, her hands folded. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before he ruled on moving the case to trial, she stood slowly. Her attorney tried to stop her. She shook her head and spoke directly to the gallery, where her now-adult son sat in the back row. "I never wanted it to come to this," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Michael was not a good man. He hurt me in ways I couldn't speak about, couldn't prove, couldn't escape. That night we fought like we always fought, but this time I fought back. I didn't plan it. It just happened. And then I panicked. I thought if there was no body, if there was no evidence, if I just cleaned everything and stuck to my story, eventually everyone would forget and we could have a normal life. I wanted to give my son a normal life." She looked directly at her son. "I'm sorry you had to carry this. I'm sorry I made you doubt your own memory. I'm sorry I couldn't be the person you deserved. But I'm not sorry Michael Craig is gone. He would have destroyed us both." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. The defense attorney requested an immediate recess. The damage, however, was done. Angie Craig Fletcher had confessed, spontaneously and without prompting, to the murder of her husband. In the weeks that followed, she gave a detailed statement to investigators, describing the events of December 13, 2006, with specificity that matched the physical evidence. She described an argument that escalated into physical violence: Michael's hands around her throat, her grabbing a heavy object, striking him, the shock when he fell and didn't get up, her realization that he wasn't breathing, her decision to dispose of the body rather than face charges. She described cleaning for hours, wrapping the body, loading it into the truck, driving to the mine, digging in frozen earth until her hands bled, covering everything carefully, returning home before dawn, calling the sheriff's office hours later with her rehearsed story. She was convicted on March 21, 2024, after a trial that lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of second-degree murder. Sentencing occurred on May 15, 2024. The judge, taking into account the circumstances but unable to overlook the premeditation evident in the cleanup and disposal, sentenced Angie Craig Fletcher to 30 years in prison with possibility of parole after serving 20. She would be 70 years old before she could hope for release. Michael Craig's family attended the sentencing. His mother, now in her 80s, read a victim impact statement. "My son was not perfect," she said, her voice breaking. "He had his demons, he made mistakes, but he did not deserve to die in the dark and be left in the cold ground for 17 years. He did not deserve to be erased from his son's life. Whatever he did, whatever happened between them, he deserved a chance to face it, to answer for it, to change." She took that from him. She took him from all of us, and now finally we can lay him to rest. Michael Craig was buried in June 2024 in a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking the Salmon River. More than 200 people attended the service. His son stood at the graveside, tears streaming down his face, finally able to mourn someone who had been gone for more than 2/3 of his life. A headstone marks the spot now, simple granite with dates and a single line, "Forever missed, finally home." The question of whether Angie Craig acted in self-defense, whether years of abuse justified her actions, whether the circumstances mitigate her guilt, these questions continue to be debated. The legal system has provided its answer. History will judge the rest. What remains undeniable is that a man disappeared on a winter night in a small Idaho town, that his absence left a wound in the community that never healed, that the truth took 18 years to surface, and that a child carried the weight of terrible knowledge until he was finally old enough and strong enough to speak it aloud. Closing. This case reminds us that silence has its own violence, that unspoken truths corrode everything they touch, that justice delayed is still justice worth pursuing. Michael Craig's story did not end in December 2006. It ended in a courtroom in 2024, when the truth finally emerged from beneath years of carefully maintained lies. His son, who will carry the burden of his testimony for the rest of his life, gave his father the only thing he could: acknowledgement, recognition, a grave marked with his name. In the end, that is all any of us can ask: to be remembered, to be mourned, to have our absence matter. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.